The Elder warned of humanity's revenge, but the galaxy refused to listen. The vote was already decided before Velthara finished his first sentence. I could see it in the way the delegates shifted in their seats, that slow, dismissive lean back that powerful people do when they have already made up their minds and are simply waiting for the noise to stop. 41 species, represented by their finest minds, and not one of them was actually listening to the oldest living creature in the known galaxy. Velthara stood at the center podium of the Grand Conclave Chamber, and I want to be clear about something. This was not a frail, trembling elder. He was 912 years old, yes, but the Zelkai do not age the way humans do. He was tall, silver-skinned, with eyes that had the particular quality of things that have seen too much and chosen, carefully, what to remember. When he spoke, his voice carried without effort, the way a deep river carries without rushing. I am going to tell you something, he said, and I am going to ask you to believe me because I have earned that much. The Vorathan ambassador, a creature named Drathkoval, wide-shouldered and copper-scaled, who had never personally been within 500 light-years of an actual conflict, made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. I noticed. I wrote it down. I was good at noticing things that would matter later, which is perhaps why I had been assigned to this chamber as a human observer rather than left behind on the sector transport with the rest of the delegation. My name is Aris. I was 29 years old. I had been working for Earth's diplomatic office for 4 years, and I was, on that day, one of 11 humans permitted inside the conclave chamber. We were not permitted to speak. We were permitted to sit in the observer row and watch the 41 species of the Galactic Assembly make decisions about our future. This was, in the language of the Treaty of Keshari, called inclusive non-voting participation. In the language of my mother, who had grown up under the first round of sanctions, it was called something else entirely. Velthara did not look at the ambassador. He had learned, 9 centuries in, not to waste his attention on contempt. 43 years ago, he said, I fought alongside human soldiers during the Keth incursion at the Meridian Passage. I want the chamber to understand what I mean when I say alongside. I do not mean I observed from a command ship. I mean I was in the field. I mean I watched them operate under conditions that had broken 3 other species before lunch. A few delegates straightened slightly. The Keth incursion was not a comfortable memory for anyone who had been alive for it. The Keth had been efficient in a way that still showed up in diplomatic nightmares, a collective intelligence that moved like a single organism and hit like a natural disaster. The Meridian Passage had been a genuine emergency, the kind where species stopped arguing about who was responsible and started begging for help. Humanity had answered. What I witnessed, Velthara continued, was not simply courage. Courage is common. Every species I have ever met produces courageous individuals. What I witnessed was something specific to humans that I have spent 4 decades trying to find adequate language for. He paused. When humans are pressed, truly pressed, past the point where other species begin calculating the cost of survival, they do not slow down. They accelerate. They become more creative, not less. They become more coordinated, not less. They find solutions that should not exist given the available resources. And they do all of this with a particular emotion that I have not observed elsewhere in any consistent form. The chamber was quiet, not respectful quiet, waiting for the punchline quiet. The emotion, Velthara said, is called not yet. I felt something move in my chest when he said that. I did not write it down. He went on. He laid it out simply, which was, I think, the choice of someone who had stopped expecting to be understood and was now simply making sure the record would be clear. Humanity had been sanctioned under the Treaty of Keshari 30 years ago, following what the Conclave called territorial aggression near the Rim colonies. Our FTL network had been dismantled. Our fleet had been reduced to a handful of permitted patrol vessels. Our colonies had been cut from 47 to 3. The sanctions had been presented as temporary, subject to review every 5 years. They had been renewed without serious debate 6 times. Velthara said, "You have placed a species with a documented history of surviving extinction-level events inside a cage and told them they should be grateful. I am asking you, as someone who has stood beside them in the worst circumstances I have personally witnessed, to reconsider what you believe you are managing." Drath Koval spoke without being recognized by the chair. "Elder Velthara, with respect, humans have been quiet for 30 years. Your concern, while noted, appears to be based on historical sentiment rather than current evidence." "Yes," Velthara said, "they have been quiet for 30 years. He said it the way you might say the ocean has been quiet all morning, before describing a wave. The vote proceeded. 37 in favor of extending and tightening the sanctions, 3 against, 1 abstention. The tightening meant reduced communication bandwidth for our remaining colonies, additional inspection rights for conclave vessels in human space, and a new provision that would allow allied species to conduct resource compliance audits on our permitted worlds without prior notice. I wrote all of it down. Velthara was escorted from the podium by 2 conclave security officers, a purely ceremonial formality, since he had already said what he came to say and had no intention of causing a scene. He walked past the observer row on his way out, and for one moment his eyes met mine. He did not look sorry for us. He looked sorry for the room. I packed my notes into my carry case and followed the rest of the human delegation through the side corridor toward the transit bay. None of us spoke. There was a particular kind of silence that humans produce when they are holding something in, not sadness, not exactly anger, something more focused than either of those. I had grown up inside that silence. I knew its texture. My personal communicator signaled once, a priority transmission on a frequency that was not, officially, registered to any active government channel. The message was 4 words. Phase 1 is complete. I read it twice. I looked up at the corridor ceiling, at the soft bioluminescent panels the conclave used because 17 of its member species found standard lighting uncomfortable. I thought about Velthara's face. I thought about the way Drath Koval had made that small sound when the elder started speaking. I thought about 30 years. Then I put the communicator away and kept walking. Behind me in the chamber, the delegates were already filing out, already moving on to the next item on the agenda. They had dealt with the human question efficiently. They had done it before. They expected to do it again in 5 years. Same chamber, same vote, same comfortable margin. What they did not know, what I was only beginning to understand myself, was that for 30 years, while the galaxy had been managing us, we had been doing something else entirely. Velthara had known. He had stood in that chamber and told them, as plainly as 9 centuries of careful language could manage, that something was coming, and the galaxy had leaned back in its chairs and waited for the noise to stop. The noise, as it turned out, had never been the point. I need to tell you about my mother, before I tell you about the room beneath the Martian pole. She was an engineer, not a famous one, not the kind whose name ends up on plaques, the kind who shows up every morning and solves the problem that is actually in front of her rather than the one she would prefer to be solving. She grew up in the first decade of the sanctions, which meant she grew up watching the FTL network come down piece by piece, like a city losing its lights one neighborhood at a time. She never talked about it the way people talk about grief. She talked about it the way people talk about weather, as a fact that shapes what you do next. She used to say, the most dangerous thing you can do to an engineer is take something away from them. I did not fully understand what she meant until the day, 6 months after the conclave vote, that I walked through a pressure door 400 meters beneath the Martian surface and saw what 30 years of taken-away things had produced. My new assignment was official, if you read it quickly. I had been transferred to the Office of Quiet Logistics, which was exactly what it sounded like if you did not look closely, a department responsible for the decommissioning and recycling of old fleet infrastructure. We processed retired vessels, cataloged salvageable components, filed the paperwork that said a ship no longer existed. It was, on the surface, administrative work of the dullest possible kind. On the surface, the man who met me at the bottom of the elevator shaft was named Gordon, older, compact, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades being careful. He did not shake my hand. He handed me a sealed badge and said, "You have 12 hours to decide if you want to know what you are about to see. Once you see it, the 12 hours are gone." "I already decided," I said. "I know," he said. "I just have to ask." What I saw over the next 4 hours is difficult to describe, not because it was visually complicated, but because it required me to rearrange everything I thought I knew about the previous 30 years. The scale was the first thing. The facility beneath the Martian pole was not a facility. It was a city, a manufacturing city, pressurized, heated, running on power sources that did not appear anywhere in the official energy consumption reports, because they were not in the official energy consumption reports. It stretched further than I could see from the central overlook where Gordon had brought me, a vast organized network of production lines and research bays and testing chambers that hummed with the particular sound of things being built to very precise specifications. "How long?" I asked. "The planning started the day the treaty was signed," Gordon said. "The physical work started about 8 years in, once we had enough of the theory locked down." 30 years, I said. 32, if you count the modeling phase. He said it without drama. That was the thing about Gordon. He had the affect of a man discussing a completed crossword. He walked me through it in sections, the way you walk someone through a house you have spent years building, pointing out what each room is for and why it is shaped the way it is. I will not try to describe all of it because some of it I still do not fully understand, even now. What I can describe is the impression it made, the overwhelming, vertiginous sense that I had been living on the visible surface of something whose true depth I had never imagined. The ships were the first thing most people would notice, and I noticed them too. They were not like the old human fleet, the vessels that had been mothballed and processed according to treaty terms. These were different in a way that went beyond size or armament. They had a different logic to them, a design philosophy that had evolved in isolation from the rest of the galaxy's conventional wisdom and arrived somewhere the rest of the galaxy had not yet considered reaching. I am not an engineer. I could not tell you specifically what made them different, but I had grown up around engineers, and I recognized the look of something that works better than it has any right to. Gordon showed me the propulsion systems first. The Conclave's monitoring had focused, as it always had, on the obvious markers, hull mass, weapon signatures, energy output profiles that matched known military configurations. What they had not looked for, because it had not existed before, was a drive architecture that produced a completely different output signature. It did not look like a military drive because it was not a military drive in any category they had defined. It was something new, developed from scratch in a sealed research program that had been running for 25 years. "They check our fuel consumption reports," Gordon said. "Yes," I said. "They check the right numbers," he said. "They just don't know those aren't the only numbers." The weapons were more subtle, which surprised me. I had expected something dramatic, the kind of overwhelming firepower that makes a point by existing. What I found instead was precision work. Systems designed not to destroy on a large scale but to reach into a specific thing and stop it without touching anything around it. It took me a moment to understand the philosophy behind it, and when I did, it was Velthara's voice I heard in my head, not yet. Humans had not built a hammer. They had built 1,000 different keys, each one fitted to a specific lock. "We studied everyone," Gordon said when I asked. "For 30 years we studied everyone, every species, every system, every doctrine. We know how the Vorathan defense grid authenticates. We know the mech collective's communication lag at extended range. We know which conclave members have private agreements with which others and what those agreements are worth. He paused. Knowing was the easy part. The hard part was not using any of it until we were ready. I thought about the conclave chamber, about Drathkovel's small dismissive sound. Were there moments, I asked, when people wanted to move early? Gordon was quiet for a moment. Yes. What stopped them? The patient's engine, he said. He took me to it. It was in a room off the main research corridor, and it was not what I expected from the name, not a machine, not a display system in any conventional sense, but a wall-sized projection that showed, in careful detail, a timeline. It began 32 years ago, on the day the treaty was signed, and it extended forward in precise increments through every phase of what they had been building. Each node had a readiness threshold. Each threshold had been met and logged in green. I could see the whole shape of it, 32 years of deliberate, invisible progress, mapped out and followed like a long, patient piece of music. At the bottom of the display, in small plain text, was the name of the person who had built the original projection. It was my mother's name. I stood in front of that wall for a long time. Gordon did not say anything. He was the kind of man who understood when something needed space. She had never told me. In all the conversations we had about engineering, about the sanctions, about the slow, difficult business of living with dignity inside a cage you did not choose, she had never once said, "By the way, I mapped the road out of this. I built the instrument that told us when we would be ready." I thought about her comment. The most dangerous thing you can do to an engineer is take something away from them. She had not been talking about grief. She had been talking about motivation. That evening, Gordon handed me a secure communication. The encryption signature was one I recognized, not from official channels, but from a contact frequency I had been given, quietly, months before and told to check only if something changed. The message was from Velthara. It said, "I am not warning anyone anymore. I would like to help. If you are ready to receive me, say so." I sat with it for a while. Then I sent back 3 words. "We are ready." The supply ship was called the Doris Callan, which was not a heroic name, and that was the point. She was registered as a decommissioned agricultural transport, the kind of low-priority vessel that conclave inspection teams logged and moved past without much attention, because there was nothing about her that suggested she was worth stopping. Her hull was old enough to have actual wear on it. Her transponder signal was legitimate. Her cargo manifest listed seed grain and water reclamation parts, which was exactly the kind of thing a restricted human colony would need, and exactly the kind of thing no one in the conclave's monitoring apparatus considered interesting. Her captain was a woman named Helen Cross, 54 years old, former Navy, who had spent the last 12 years flying what looked like the most boring route in human space. I had never met her in person. I knew her file. She had the particular quality that Gordon also had, a deep, practiced calm that came not from the absence of feeling, but from the presence of a very long plan. The call came into our office at 400 station time. One of our analysts, a young man named Peter Cole, was first to flag it. He was new enough that his voice still went tight when something urgent happened. He said, "Sir, we have a situation at Kepler's Rest." And even in those words I could hear the specific quality of a thing going wrong in a way that had been expected. Kepler's Rest was one of humanity's 3 remaining permitted colonies. Low gravity, high farmland yield, about 60,000 people. It was not a military asset. It was not a strategic position. It had no particular significance in the geography of galactic politics except that it was ours, and it was alive. And the people on it grew food and raised children, and went about the quiet work of existing inside the limits the conclave had set for them. The Vorathan border fleet, 7 vessels, under the command of an admiral named Val Saren, had moved into orbit above Kepler's Rest at 200, and declared a proximity compliance audit under Article 19 of the amended Treaty of Keshari. Article 19 existed. It was real. It had been added to the treaty during the fourth renewal, buried in the administrative language that nobody reads carefully because it sounds procedural. What it meant, in practice, was that any allied conclave species could park their fleet above a restricted human world and demand access to any facility they considered relevant to treaty compliance. It was legal. It was also a message, the kind of message that does not need to spell itself out because its meaning is in the act of sending it. Within 6 hours, the blockade was complete. Nothing was going in or out of Kepler's rest. The Vorathan fleet was professional about it, no threats, no hostile transmissions, just presence, heavy and deliberate, like a hand placed flat on a table to demonstrate how large it is. Peter Cole flagged the second problem 8 hours after the first. "Sir," he said, "the colony's medical transport clearance has been denied." I put down what I was reading. "They have a resupply due," he continued carefully, "carrying itrelocin for the colony's pediatric ward. 43 children are currently in treatment for kennel fever. Itrelocin is the standard intervention. Without the resupply," he stopped. "I know what kennel fever does without itrelocin," I said. Kennel fever was not typically a serious illness. In a population with regular medical access, it was unpleasant, manageable, resolved within 2 weeks with proper treatment. In a population cut off from resupply, in children under 12, it became something else. The progression was fast and not kind. I filed the emergency notification to the Conclave Medical Oversight Board. I filed it through proper channels, with full documentation, with the specific names and ages of the children in treatment, with the timeline of what would happen if the supply clearance was not granted. I was thorough. I had been trained to be thorough. The Conclave Medical Oversight Board responded in 11 hours. Their response was 5 paragraphs explaining why Article 19 compliance audits took procedural precedence over routine resupply clearances, and that the colony's medical situation, while noted with concern, fell within the parameters of standard treaty enforcement activities. They used the phrase, "while noted with concern," twice. I read the response at my desk. Peter Cole was watching me from across the room. He was 23 years old and had joined the diplomatic office because he believed that careful, patient, institutional engagement was the right way to solve problems. He had believed that when he started. I watched him reading the same 5 paragraphs on his own screen, and I watched something change in his face. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way a temperature drops. The Shadow Council convened that evening via encrypted channel. I was not a member. I was a senior liaison, which meant I was present and informed but did not have a vote. The council had 7 members. Their names are not mine to give. They had a range of views, and they did not agree on everything, which was, I think, what made them effective when they did agree. The discussion lasted 4 hours. I listened to all of it. 3 members argued for restraint. Their case was not weak. They pointed out that certain preparation phases were not yet fully validated, that moving before complete readiness carried its own risks, that the situation at Kepler's Rest, as terrible as it was, might be used as a forcing mechanism to extract a premature response. They were not arguing for inaction. They were arguing for a few more months. 4 members argued that a few more months meant children, who would not have a few more months. The vote was 4-3. I remember that number. I still think about it. Helen Cross received her orders at 200. She did not ask questions. She began her approach to Kepler's Rest at 600, on the direct route, at standard speed, broadcasting her cargo manifest as she went. The Vorathan fleet tracked her from the moment she entered the system. Valsaren's operations officer hailed her at 400,000 kilometers and ordered her to halt for inspection. Helen Cross replied that she was carrying medical supplies for children under emergency need, and requested expedited clearance under the conclave humanitarian provision. Valsaren's officer told her the humanitarian provision did not supersede active compliance audit procedures. Helen Cross said she understood and continued on her heading. The Vorathan fleet fired a warning shot at 200,000 kilometers. It passed well clear of the Doris Callan, the kind of shot designed to communicate resolve, not cause damage. Helen Cross continued on her heading. At 150,000 kilometers, Valsaren's flagship broadcast a final stop order. This one carried force of intent. The targeting locks were live. I was watching the feed from a relay station with Peter Cole and 4 other analysts. Nobody in the room was breathing very comfortably. Helen Cross did not stop. What happened next took 11 seconds. The Doris Callan released a single pulse device, categorically not a weapon under any existing conclave definition, because the category it belonged to had not existed until approximately 6 months ago, when the research team that built it decided to call it a resonance interrupt and leave the treaty categorization question for lawyers to sort out later. The pulse traveled outward from the Doris Callan in a precise spherical pattern and interacted with the Vorathan fleet's propulsion systems in a way that Valsaren's engineers would spend the next 4 days trying to understand. Every ship in the Vorathan fleet went still. Not dark, the crew life support, the communications, the internal systems were all completely untouched. The ships were fully functional in every sense except one. They could not move. They sat in orbit above Kepler's rest like 7 very large, very surprised monuments to the gap between what you think you are managing and what is actually going on. The Doris Callan continued her approach, docked at Kepler's rest without incident, and began offloading Itralasan. Helen Cross sent one line back to us after docking. Medical team reports 43 children stable, resupply complete. I read it and then I looked at Peter Cole. He was sitting very still, his hands flat on the desk in front of him. His expression was something I did not have a quick name for. It was not triumph. It was something quieter and heavier and more honest than triumph. The message to the conclave went out under my signature, because I was the senior liaison, and that was what senior liaisons were for. It was 3 words long. We remember everything. The response from the conclave came in 17 hours later. Urgent, multiple signatures, demanding explanation, demanding accountability, demanding that humanity provide a full technical disclosure of what had been deployed above Kepler's rest. I drafted a polite acknowledgement and said we would be in touch. Valsaren's fleet regained propulsion capability 72 hours after the pulse, exactly as designed. They left Kepler's rest orbit without filing a compliance report. I do not know what Valsaren told his superiors. I imagine the conversation was not comfortable. The 3 council members who had voted to wait sent a joint message to the full council. It said only, "We stand corrected, for now." I read that too. I kept all of it. The conclave did not know what it was looking at, and that was the first advantage. They had spent 30 years monitoring humanity through the lens of what they expected: fleet tonnage, weapon signatures, energy output, the standard metrics of power that every species in the known galaxy used to measure each other. They were very good at counting the things they knew to count. The problem, which became apparent over approximately 72 hours following the Kepler's rest incident, was that we had not built the things they knew to count. I was in the operations room when the first intelligence report came in from the Conclave Security Council. Peter Cole handed it to me without comment. I read it twice. It was a detailed, thoroughly researched, carefully argued document that was completely wrong about almost everything it thought it knew. The conclave believed the Kepler's rest incident had been an isolated demonstration, a single specialized device deployed from a single ship, a one-time capability that humanity had been saving for a specific provocation. Their threat assessment concluded that we had shown our hand, that the hand was smaller than feared, and that a firm, coordinated response would resolve the situation efficiently. I set the report down and did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Peter, pull up the schedule." Peter pulled it up. The schedule showed the next 48 hours. It was full. What happened over those 48 hours was not, I want to be clear, a military campaign. There were no engagements in the conventional sense. No shots were fired, no vessels were destroyed, no lives were taken. What happened was a series of moments that were carefully, deliberately designed to teach the same lesson from different angles until the lesson could not be misunderstood. The conclave's private deliberation channels had been secure for 60 years. The encryption architecture was built by the Mech Collective, who were the best in the galaxy at that particular kind of mathematics, and no one had ever successfully penetrated it. It was, by universal consensus, unbreakable. On the morning of the second day after Kepler's rest, every member of the Conclave Security Council received a private transmission. The transmission contained the full text of their internal deliberations for the past 20 years, every private vote, every off-record conversation, every compromise and calculation and confidential agreement that had been kept from the public record of the conclave. It was not selected content. It was everything in order, fully indexed. The covering note was brief. It said, "We have been listening. We listened because we needed to understand you. We are sharing this now not to cause harm but to demonstrate that we could have caused harm at any moment for the past 2 decades, and chose not to. This is the shape of the choice we have been making. We would like you to consider carefully what it means." I learned later that the conclave chamber went completely silent for 6 minutes after the transmissions were received. 6 minutes is a very long time in a room where 41 species are trying to decide how to respond to something that has just reordered their understanding of the previous 20 years. The Vorathan home system came next. Valsaren's fleet had returned to Vorathan space nursing its bruised propulsion systems, and what I imagine was a significant institutional embarrassment. The Vorathan defense grid, their home system's primary security architecture, built over 4 decades and considered the most robust in the midrim, ran on an authentication system that cycled its access codes every 72 hours. It had never been compromised. The mathematics behind it were sound. The implementation had a flaw that a human research team had identified 9 years ago and spent 3 years quietly verifying before spending another 6 years preparing to use it. On the 3rd morning, the Vorathan defense grid completed its routine authentication cycle and found that its codes had been changed. Every access point, every defensive platform, every patrol beacon was now operating on credentials that only one party held. Vorathan System Defense Command spent 4 hours trying to understand what had happened before they received a transmission from a human vessel that had materialized, without triggering a single alarm, in high orbit above the Vorathan home world. The vessel was not armed for combat. It was broadcasting. What it was broadcasting was a classified document, a military planning file, dated 3 years prior, detailing a proposed Vorathan operation against Kepler's rest, not a compliance audit. The full proposal, with phase breakdowns and timeline and projected resource yield, for the annexation of Kepler's rest as a Vorathan agricultural holding. The proposal had been discussed internally and never formally submitted. It had been considered, evaluated, and set aside for a more convenient moment. The broadcast reached every communication receiver in the Vorathan home system before the defense grid could be restored. The Vorathan public heard it. The Vorathan Parliament heard it. Every allied conclave member with a receiver in range heard it. The accompanying human transmission said, "We are not here to destroy anything. We are here to be understood. This document represents what was planned for our people. We would like the record to be complete. I was watching the feeds in the operations room. Gordon was standing next to me. He had not said much in the previous 48 hours. There was a particular quality to his silence that I was learning to read, not satisfaction exactly, but the feeling of a very long and very careful piece of work arriving at the point it was always heading toward. "The Mech Collective is going to be next," he said. "I know," I said. The Mech Collective had sent a fleet toward human space as soon as the Vorathan home system incident became public. 17 vessels, their most capable configuration, moving at best speed. They were, by any reasonable assessment, a serious threat. The Mech Collective built excellent ships, and the beings inside them were not casual about conflict. The fleet stopped at the edge of human space and received a transmission. The transmission contained technical schematics. Specifically, it contained schematics for the Mech Collective's own most advanced propulsion and computing systems, not as they currently existed, but as they would exist in approximately 20 years based on their current research trajectory. The human research teams had been studying mech technology for 3 decades. They had mapped it, modeled it, extended it forward along its own internal logic, and then continued developing from that point. What the mech fleet received was their own future technology, reverse-engineered forward and refined, sitting in a human database that had been waiting for the right moment to be shared. The covering note said, "We studied you while you were not watching us. We understand your systems better than you currently do. We are sharing this because we would like you to understand that the past 30 years were not wasted on our end. We are interested in a different relationship than the one we have had. This is an opening, if you choose to take it." The mech fleet sat at the edge of human space for 11 hours. Then it turned around. I was watching all of it from the operations room, cycling through feeds, reading the reports as they came in. Velthara was on the station by then. He had arrived 2 days after I sent him the message saying we were ready, traveling on a small personal ship with no escort, with the specific unhurried quality of someone who had been waiting a long time for something, and was not going to rush it now that it had arrived. He came to the operations room once, during the second night. I was the only one there at that hour. He stood at the window that looked down onto the main floor and watched the screens for a while without speaking. I said, "You knew all of this, not the specifics, but you knew." "I knew what humans do," he said, "when you give them 30 years and a reason." "Is that why you warned them?" "I warned them because I thought it was the right thing to do," he said. "I also knew they would not listen. Those two things are not contradictory." "What happens now?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Now you have to decide what you do with it." I thought about the 3 council members who had voted to wait. I thought about my mother's name at the bottom of the patient's engine display. I thought about Helen Cross saying 43 children stable and the particular weight of those words. "We already know what we're going to do," I said. Velthara looked at me with those ancient eyes that had seen too many things to count. "I know what your council has decided," he said. "I mean after that, 5 years from now, 20 years, when the fear has settled and the power is comfortable and new decisions have to be made. That is when I do not know what humans will choose." I did not have an answer. I do not think he expected one. On the operations room screens, the Conclave Security Council was convening an emergency session. The request for formal negotiations had been submitted by 14 member species simultaneously, which was, apparently, a procedural record. It had never happened before. Peter Cole had left a note on my desk. It said only, "Sir, I think we should probably respond to some of these." I sat down and started writing. The chamber was quiet. Not the waiting for the noise to stop quiet I remembered from 3 years ago. A different kind, the kind that comes after something has shifted, and everyone in the room is still adjusting to standing on new ground. I was at the table this time. Not the observer row. The table, the long curved surface of polished material that reflected the bioluminescent panels above, where 41 species sat in their designated positions, and where, for the first time in 30 years, there was now a seat with a human nameplate in front of it. My nameplate. I had not asked for this particular posting. The restored diplomatic office had offered it to 3 other people before me, all of whom had legitimate reasons to say no, reasons involving families, health, other work that mattered. I had said yes because I had been in the observer row when Velthara spoke, and I thought that mattered, the way certain experiences create a kind of responsibility you cannot put down cleanly. The formal renegotiation had taken 11 weeks. This was, by conclave standards, extremely fast. By human standards, given that we had been waiting 30 years, it felt like 11 weeks. The negotiating team on our side had been led by a woman named Clara Ford, who was 61 years old, and had spent the last decade in what the diplomatic office called advisory retirement, which meant she was too valuable to actually let go, but could not be given an official title without alerting conclave monitoring systems to the fact that she was important. She negotiated the way she apparently did everything, without drama, without performance, with an absolute clarity about what she would accept and what she would not, and a patience that seemed to have no floor. What we brought to the table, the documented record of the Kepler's Rest blockade, the conclave's own classified deliberations from the past 20 years, the Vorathan planning document, and the technical demonstration that had been running for the past 3 months. What we asked for: full FTL rights, restoration of our colony network, a seat on the Conclave Security Council, and a formal review mechanism that would prevent sanctions of the kind we had lived under from being applied to any species in the future without independent oversight. We did not ask for territory. We did not ask for reparations. We did not ask for the political careers of the people who had voted for each sanction renewal, though the records existed and some of our people had argued for it. Clara Ford had been clear about this from the first session. She said, "We are not here to collect. We are here to establish the terms of a relationship that will last longer than any of us. The terms need to be ones we can all live with." Drath Koval was not at the table. He had resigned his ambassadorship 6 weeks after Kepler's Rest, citing health reasons. His replacement was a Vorathan diplomat named Sen Varl, who was younger, quieter, and had the specific quality of someone who had read the situation carefully and arrived determined not to repeat the previous administration's mistakes. Sen Varl had said almost nothing during the 11 weeks of negotiation. When he did speak, it was precise and it was honest, which made him unusual in that room. The vote on the final terms was 39 in favor, 0 against, 2 abstentions. The 2 abstentions were species that had not attended most of the sessions, and whose delegates had clearly not read the full documentation. This was, by any measure, not a situation that rewarded not reading the documentation. When the vote was announced, there was no celebration in the chamber. People rose and moved toward the signing tables in the particular organized way that large diplomatic gatherings move, purposeful, careful, aware that the room is watching. I signed where I was supposed to sign. Several cameras recorded it. I looked at the nameplate in front of me and thought of Velthara's face in the corridor 3 years ago, looking sorry for the room. Afterward, in the corridor outside the chamber, Sen Varl found me. "I have a question," he said, "and I am asking it personally, not diplomatically." "All right," I said. "Why didn't you take more?" he said. "You had the capability. You had the leverage. The political moment was yours. You could have set terms that gave humanity an enormously advantageous position for the next century. Several of my colleagues believe you made a strategic error." I had thought about this question. I had been thinking about it since the morning after the Mech Collective's fleet turned around, when I had sat in the operations room with cold coffee and the weight of everything that had happened in the previous 48 hours, and tried to work out what I actually felt. "Do you know what the hardest part of the past 30 years was?" I asked. Senvara waited. "It wasn't the sanctions," I said. "It wasn't watching the FTL network come down. It wasn't the colony reductions or the inspection rights or the resource audits. Those were painful. People's lives were shaped by them. Children grew up in less freedom because of them, including children in Kepler's Rest who nearly didn't survive because of them." I stopped. The hardest part was knowing what we were capable of and choosing every day not to use it, not because we couldn't. Because we were still deciding what kind of people we wanted to be when this was over. Senvara looked at me steadily. He had excellent stillness, the Vorathan, it was a species trait, I had read, an evolutionary inheritance from a predator background that had become, over millennia, a tool of social intelligence. "And what kind of people did you decide to be?" he said. "The kind that stops," I said. "The kind that knows where the line is and doesn't cross it, not because crossing it was impossible, because it matters that we chose not to." He nodded slowly. It was not quite agreement. It was closer to understanding, which I thought was worth more. The ceremony for the 3 council members who had voted to wait was held 2 weeks after the signing, in a small hall in the restored Human Government District. It was not a lavish event. The hall held about 200 people. The 3 council members, I can tell you now that one of them was Gordon, which surprised me for about 4 seconds before it stopped surprising me, received the highest civilian award the restored government had reinstated. The award was called the Clearwater, which was not a dramatic name, and that seemed right. Gordon caught my eye across the room during the ceremony. I gave him a small nod. He returned it and looked away, back to the speaker at the front. That was Gordon. 32 years of patience, and he was not going to get sentimental about receiving an award for it. I found Velthara in the observation dome that evening. He was one of the things that surprised people, that he was still here, still on the station, still interested in what happened next. Zelkai of his age did not generally stay in motion. They tended to settle, to become stationary points of wisdom that other people traveled to. Velthara had been moving steadily for 900 years, and he did not seem ready to stop. He was watching the stars the way very old things watch things they have watched for a very long time, not casually, not admiringly, but with a deep attention that had long ago moved past the need to find the experience beautiful. "How are you?" I asked. "Thinking," he said. I sat down nearby and did not say anything. The dome gave a full view of the star field. The slow rotation of the station brought different sections into sight every few minutes, the familiar constellations of this part of the galaxy moving in their unhurried arc. Somewhere out there was Kepler's Rest, where 60,000 people were going about their lives under an open sky that was now, for the first time in 30 years, not watched from above by someone else's fleet. Somewhere out there was Earth, where the cities that had never fully lost their light were now fully themselves again. "You told me," I said eventually, "that you didn't know which version of us would win, the double nature." "I remember," he said. "Do you have an opinion now?" He considered for a long time. The dome rotated. New stars came into view. "I have an observation," he said, "not an opinion. Opinions require more certainty than I have left." "What's the observation?" "The version of you that built all of this," he said, "spent 30 years not using it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the most significant data point I have ever collected about your species." "But," I said, because I could hear that there was one. "But the version of you that built it also built it," he said. "Both things are true. The restraint and the capability, the choice not to and the very real ability to. I have met species that had the restraint without the capability. I have met species that had the capability without the restraint. I have never, in 900 years, met a species that had both at full development simultaneously, and was trying, consciously, to keep them in balance. "Is that good?" I asked. "It is unprecedented," he said. "I have no data set for it. I cannot tell you if it is good. I can tell you it is the most interesting thing I have ever encountered, and I have encountered a great many things." We sat with that for a while. I thought about Peter Cole, who had grown up during the sanctions and joined the diplomatic office because he believed in the institutions, and then spent 3 years watching the institutions fail, and then watched something else step in to do what the institutions would not. He was running his own department now. He had gotten quieter, which I thought was not entirely a bad sign, the particular quiet of someone who had added a layer of complexity to their understanding and was still working out what to do with it. I thought about Helen Cross on the Doris Callan, continuing on her heading while targeting locks went live at 150,000 kilometers. I had met her in person finally, at a reception 2 months after Kepler's rest. She was exactly as I had imagined from her file, compact, composed, with the faint quality of someone who has made a very large decision and has had time to settle into it. She had shaken my hand and said, 43 kids, and I had said yes, and that had been the whole conversation, and it had been enough. I thought about Clara Ford, who had sat across from the conclave's finest negotiators for 11 weeks, and had not given an inch on the core terms, and had also, apparently, spent 3 evenings of those 11 weeks having quiet off-record conversations with Sen Varl about how to make the framework durable, not just advantageous. That was the kind of thing that didn't make it into official histories, the small deliberate acts of building something that might actually last. I thought about my mother, whose name was at the bottom of a timeline in a room beneath the Martian pole. I had gone back there, after the signing, to walk through the facility one more time. The production lines were quieter now. Some of them had shifted to civilian applications, the technology finding its way into purposes that were not about leverage or demonstration, but about the simple and ongoing work of making life better. The patient's engine display was still there. I stood in front of it for a while, looking at her name. I had called her before I came. We had talked for a long time, which we did not always manage. I told her about the signing. She told me about the project she was working on now, something involving agricultural applications of the propulsion research, which she thought was funny in a specific way she did not entirely explain. I told her I had seen her name on the display. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know if you would. I put it there because I wanted someone to know it wasn't accidental, any of it." "I know," I said. "Good," she said, and moved on to talking about the agricultural project, because she was an engineer and there was always a next problem to be interested in. I finished the personal log I had been writing in sections over the past several months. It was not an official document, nothing that would go into the record, nothing that would be read at ceremonies or quoted in analyses. It was addressed to my children, who were 4 and 2 years old, who had been born during the sanctions period and had no memory of it, who were growing up on an Earth that was fully itself again without knowing what it had cost to get there. I wanted them to know, not the dramatic version, not the version that flattens 30 years of complicated choices into a clean story about patience rewarded. I wanted them to know about the 3 council members who had voted to wait. I wanted them to know about the 11-hour vote and the 4-3 margin. I wanted them to know about Gordon and the patient's engine and my mother's name at the bottom of the display, and about Velthara's face in the corridor, not sorry for us, sorry for the room, and why the difference mattered. I wanted them to know that the most important choices do not always feel like victories when you make them. They feel like weight. I told them about the Vorathan planning document, and why we had broadcast it rather than act on it privately. I told them about the Mech Collective's fleet standing at the border for 11 hours, and what it meant that we sent schematics instead of threats. I told them about Clara Ford and her specific patience and her clarity about what she would accept and what she would not. I told them about Velthara's observation, about the double nature, and about the fact that he had 900 years of data and still could not tell me if what we were doing was going to hold. I told them that was all right, that living with genuine uncertainty is not the same as living without direction, that the question Velthara had left me with, what will you do with it in 5 years, in 20 years, when the fear is settled and the power is comfortable, was not a question with a fixed answer. It was a question you had to keep answering, every time a new decision appeared, every time the capability was there, and the restraint had to be chosen again. I closed the log. I put my name at the bottom of it, under the date, under the record of where I was and what had just finished, and what, in all the ways that mattered, was just beginning. The dome rotated. New stars came into view. Velthara watched them with his deep, unhurried attention, 912 years old and still, somehow, interested in what happened next. I thought that was the most useful thing I had seen in a long time. I decided to stay interested too. The galaxy had finally listened. And in the silence after, even we were not entirely sure what we had said, only that we had meant it, and that meaning it was not the end of anything. It was, carefully and without ceremony, the beginning.